My name is Ben Vershbow. I'm the director of NYPL Labs, or the New York Public Library Labs. We're a team here at the library, actually spread across 2 locations in our system, who work on extending the digital life of our research collections and archives. And this involves digitizing material, getting descriptions of material from our catalog systems into kind of a web-facing form, building access websites to bring these things online, and then developing projects that really extend the utility and accessibility of these materials in a digital context. And that includes doing programs and engaging creators and technologists and other practitioners in the community locally and globally to work with these materials in new ways to see what's possible when this library becomes part of the internet. So we're here today to spend most of our time talking about a fantastic project, Old NYC, which I assume most of you have had some at least glancing contact with and brought you here. And we'll be hearing a lot from Dan Vanderkam, the creator of this project, and a little bit more about how this project came to be as a collaboration with the library. Before we get into that and introing the main event, I just want to give you a little bit more context what I mean when we're talking about public programs and engagement to elicit more activity and use and a new interpretation of our collections in a digital context. We're really working on a great and long and proud tradition of digitization at the library. The library's been digitizing material with some kind of seriousness from its collections for about 2 decades. And a lot of this started to kind of make its way online in small exhibition websites, in the early days of the web, which at their time were very big kind of production efforts and kind of really new forays for the library. About a decade ago or so, the library started to think about how do we really bring our collections kind of at some scale, like en masse, onto the internet. And a website called the Digital Gallery, which some of you may be familiar with, which became this site recently, was born. And this was really kind of for libraries of one of the first large-scale pushers of putting a large amount of material online for people to access freely. But still, the work sort of ended there. Digitization was sort of an endpoint. We would feature things online, and they would often be just sort of a way to showcase and discover materials that you could really best experience physically in kind of greater resolution and greater detail. We've started to shift that emphasis to look at digitization as the beginning of a whole set of transformations and engagements, and to start sharing these materials in higher quality formats for free. We're moving in that direction to share all our public domain material for free without any paywall or licensing required. And developing projects that really kind of extend the utility of these materials in a new context. So this is really the Digital Collections website, which I encourage you to explore and browse, and there's amazing material here. New items are added basically almost daily from our digital imaging lab. And this is really the great place to swim through our growing digital collection at some scale. From here, we are now creating programs to elicit further explorations, further investigations into this material. You may have seen some of our projects like the What's on the Menu project, which is a community-based transcription project to develop our restaurant menu collection into a searchable archive. And we've recently been kind of experimenting with residency models, extending what the library has always done in creating study rooms and residencies and fellowships where folks come in and immerse in the collections and create new works of scholarship or new creative works. We're trying to see what that looks like in a digital context, where some kind of digital creative process or digital analytical process is the thing in focus. And this is some artwork that was recently produced by a San Francisco-based artist named Jenny Odell from our public domain map collection. And these, as you can tell, are not maps. They're sort of what she calls peripheral landscapes or peripheral marginalia elements from maps, fantastical creatures, botanical elements, often tokens of conquest and colonialization, kind of decontextualized and made into these beautiful mosaics. Jenny's actually an artist who works a lot with Google Maps and looking at satellite imagery and painstakingly cropping out swimming pools and shipping containers and large mile-long cargo trains and creating beautiful abstract collages out of these. A new way of seeing this pervasive kind of satellite imagery that we're inundated with. And this perspective then turned to our historical maps and created these beautiful collages, which you can actually now see on display on a digital screen in the map division for the next few months and perhaps beyond. That's one example. We also, there's a wonderful magazine based here in New York named Triple Canopy. Anyone here familiar with Triple Canopy? They're a born digital magazine. They really focus on the digital medium as their primary outlet, but they produce a lot of print publications out of that sometimes repackage and kind of archive material that was born digitally on the web. And they're really one of the most interesting kind of ongoing experiments with form and content in a digital context, trying to take some of the best things from the kind of magazine publishing tradition and situating it in a kind of in the fast lane of the internet, but kind of slowing it down a little bit, creating structures where you can spend some time and really delve into kind of critical landscapes. We're very excited that we are hosting a residency for two fellows that Triple Canopy is commissioning and will be supporting all the way toward a publication in an issue dealing with the experience of delving through archives and libraries. And so they will have some desk space here, some special kind of attention from our staff, and an opportunity to immerse themselves here in the library. So those are a couple examples. And finally, just kind of taking a turn into the geospatial, into the geographic, which is where Dan's wonderful project is taking us. I wanted to let you know about a crazy endeavor that we've just announced, which is, this is not a joke. We are setting out to build something called the NYC Space-Time Directory. And this is basically a historical geographic search service built out of data harvested from our historical maps, especially our insurance maps of Manhattan and the other boroughs, which have this fantastic kind of building level detail in them that digitization is just the first step of getting at. We've built tools that are, with the public's help, where we are getting addresses and building footprints and all this fantastic detail of the city that has long ago vanished, but was snapshotted in these different maps. So I mentioned this because this is going to be an ongoing effort in the next few years. We're going to be looking for residents and partners to kind of collaborate with us on this. We envision this as a service for the whole city that will be built with residents and volunteers from the city. We really imagine this as a public works project for the digital age from the New York Public Library, really moving these collections into a new context. And Dan's project, and I'm going to turn this over to my colleague Shayna to introduce the project and Dan specifically, but I think as you'll see, is really kind of bringing our collections, and collections which were actually digitized over a decade ago and have been online, been accessible all this time, but were not contextualized in the way that Dan has made possible with the Old NYC project. And we really look at the Old NYC project as kind of a gesturing toward the kind of experiences we want to make possible with the Space-Time Directory, but using maps that are historically contemporary to the images, and really going back and knowing what used to be there, where that place was, what it used to be called. But we're really excited by this project, and it really gets our imagination going about what we want to make possible with our collections, beyond just putting them online, but doing things with them and really activating them. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my wonderful colleague Shayna Kimball, who is our manager of public programs and outreach, who is really kind of the orchestrator of all these things that I'm kind of gesturing to and mentioning. Yeah, keep track of what we're doing. Follow the Twitter at NYPL_labs, and you'll hear about these things from a lot of directions. But I'm going to turn this over to Shayna.
So it's my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Dan Vanderkam. Dan is a Brooklyn-based software developer. After a lengthy stint on Google Web Search, where he was helping users answer questions like, when does the sun set and how many people live in France, he spent the last year working on genome visualizations at Mount Sinai's Hammer Lab. In his spare time, Dan has worked on a wide variety of side projects, including Old SF, Old San Francisco, and Comperia. Old NYC, Dan's latest side project, developed in collaboration with the NYPL Labs team and the staff of the library's Milstein Division, which is our collection of U.S. history, local history, and genealogy, is an interactive photo map of historic New York City, which allows users to virtually time travel around their own borough, neighborhood, and city block. Specifically, Dan geocoded NYPL's photographic views of New York City 1870s to 1970s collection, which includes over 40,000 images by famous photographers such as Bernice Abbott and Alexander Alland, and a sizable portion of which were shot by the commercial photographer Percy Loomis Spear, and were commissioned by the library to document the city and its changes from the 1920s to 40s. The response to Old NYC has been positively overwhelming. Since the launch a few weeks ago, the Old NYC website has seen over 4 million page views by more than 200,000 users. Users have left nearly 1,000 comments and fixed thousands of typos in the OCR transcription fields. And hundreds of people have subscribed to receive updates about this project, and all of you have gathered here on a muggy summer evening to hear about how Old NYC came to be. We're learning that people really, really like old photos and maps of New York City. The press interest has also been really incredible. The Times, Newsweek, The Atlantic, The Guardian, Fast Company, Business Insider, and Library Journal have all covered this project, as have some local news outlets such as The Gothamist, Channel 11 News, and DNA Info. While it's terrific to see the stories that this project has generated in just a few weeks in the world, it's also had a really direct and exciting impact on the library's collections itself. The visibility and interest of Old NYC has driven a tremendous amount of traffic to digital collections, which Ben was showing before. And these, as Ben was saying, these images have been online for 10 years, and all of a sudden they have new life and extended context, which is really exciting. So we're humbled by the outstanding success of this project so far, and we're so grateful to Dan for creating something fresh and relatable that the public so clearly enjoys. And I'm going to turn it over to him in just a second, but wanted to say that what we're going to do here tonight is have Dan speak about the project, give us a tour through this wonderful creation of his, and then have some time for Q&A, and then we invite you all to join us out in the lobby for some refreshments and socializing afterwards. So without further ado, Dan.
Hey everyone. Let me just get this plugged in. Cool. All right, thanks for that introduction. So, who here has used the Old NYC website? Yeah, hopefully most people. I'll do a quick tour of the site in case anyone hasn't. So it's oldnyc.org. So you go to the site and you're presented with a map of New York City with individual markers at different intersections. And when you click a marker, it loads some images, hopefully. There we go. It loads images from that location from some point in New York City's past. So 1925, 1931, 1931. And you can browse that location through time. You can move around to different boroughs, so it's not just a project for Manhattan. There's also coverage in Brooklyn and Queens and the Bronx and Staten Island. So, for example, this is a building near my apartment. It's still there, even though it was built in 1936. The description even there says it's an older home, so it's pretty cool that it's still there. This street, for example, this is the street I live on in 1931, Kent Avenue. I had no idea that there used to be trolleys on Kent Avenue, but you can see it plainly here that there used to be a trolley track. There's a trolley going south. So you can browse around and try to find photos of wherever you live, wherever you work. Some of my favorites are actually if you go out farther into Queens. So if you go to where JFK is now. So that area has changed a little bit, right? So this is actually one of my favorites. It's a little small, but you can see the kids here. This really is a farmhouse out in the country on a country road, and that was less than 100 years ago. Here's the country road. So those are some of the areas of New York that have changed the most in the last 100 years, and you can see that on Old New York. So what else can you do? You can also you can read descriptions of the photos. So we'll talk a little bit about where these came from, but you can leave comments. So for example, if you know something about this location, you can leave a comment saying, hey, I used to live here, or my grandmother lived here when she was a child. You can add sort of your own context to the collection and improve the site for everyone that way. If there's a problem, you can also say, it's in the wrong location. There's been a few reports of that. there are a lot of amazing photographs in here. So a lot of these photographs were shot during the 1930s. So it was during the Depression. So this is one of my favorites. So this is a squatters colony on the East River. This is in the East Village now. So a lot has changed. I don't know what this guy is doing in this photo, but I suspect that the area is a little bit different now. So in this talk, I'm going to say a little bit about how this project came about, where the idea came from, and some of the work that went into it, how it went from an idea to a reality. So I just wanted to show one more image. So before I get into that, so this is a picture of the Google office, what's now the Google office in Chelsea. So when I first started working on Old New York, this was the office I worked in. And when I found this photo, that was one of these like special moments when I realized that this was going to be a really cool project. Because this was the building I was working in, half built, right, in the 1930s. So it was like a very familiar object, yet like in a very different context. You know, here's the gleaming photo from the brand new Port Authority building in the 1940s. Probably my favorite image of this collection is this one. You can see the little steam shovel there in 1931. I just like imagining trying to explain what this building would be used for in the future to the guy who's inside that steam shovel, right? So there are a lot of ways in which the city has changed over the years. So, and yeah, here's a detailed view of the Google office under construction. So where did the idea for Old New York come from? So it started with this page here and this photo. So this is a photo not of New York but of San Francisco, which is where I lived at the time I started working on these projects. So I wanted to find old photographs of my apartment. So I went to the San Francisco Public Library's website and I searched for my cross streets, so Webster and Waller, and this image came up. And here's a larger version of that image. So it turned out when I looked at this image closely that this image was taken in the 1940s from the roof of my apartment. So that was a pretty amazing realization. So I took a now shot. So this was back in 2008. So you can see it transform, right? So I mean it becomes color obviously, but you can see that actually a lot of the buildings are identical. So this building on the bottom left, if you look at it in 2008, even the ornamentation on the side of it, this little marker, that's the exact same as it was in 1945. Even features that seem not very permanent, like this ladder up to the roof of this building, it's the exact same in 2008. But there's also change as well. So if you go back to 1945, just like we saw on Kent Avenue, there's a trolley. This is Fillmore Street. So in 2008, no trolley. My absolute favorite thing about this, though, is the trees. Right? So in 1945, there are very few trees to be seen. The only trees are in the distance. But in 2008, there's trees on every street. So that's been a pretty, I don't know too much about the movement to make that happen, but that's been a pretty huge change on city streets in the last 60 years. One other thing I want to call out about this, so you see this building in the back, the top right here? It's going to be the same in 1945 and 2008, but look at the trees next to it. So 1945, 2008. 1945, 2008. So among other things, over 60 years, trees grow. So that was really awesome to find that photo and be able to do that overlay. But the thing that always bothered me about it was the only reason I found this photo was that it was labeled Webster and Waller Street, because the description said that the intersection in the foreground, so this intersection here where the people are walking, the notes say that that's Webster and Waller Street. That's wrong. It's not Webster and Waller Street. It's Waller and Fillmore Street, which is one block over. But if the image had been correctly labeled in the first place, I never would have found it, because it's all keyword search. So that was kind of where the germ of the idea for Old SF and then Old New York came from, was this experience of a mistake leading to finding this amazing photo. It made me realize that really the right way to present this information is not through keyword search. The right way to present this information is with a map. So after a few years, that led to Old SF. So this is Old SF. It may look familiar. This is the image that we were just looking at. So if you click an image, you get this light box that shows you a larger version. There's coverage of all over the city. So you can see Mission Dolores Park right after the San Francisco earthquake, when it was a refugee camp. There's one of the fun things about working on this project was that the history of San Francisco really overlaps perfectly with the history of photography. San Francisco first started to get a sizable population around 1850, which is right around when photography started to enter into the mainstream. So the entire history of the city is recorded. So this is a photograph of the Spanish mission from 1856. I think these might be the oldest photos in the collection. So it really spans the entire history of the city. And you can, if you want to find photos from before the earthquake, say, it has this cool little time slider feature where you can go before the earthquake and see what, say, Market Street used to look like before it all burned down in 1906. So this project launched in 2011, but as it's an engineering project, it kind of took me longer than I expected it to. So by the time I launched it, I'd actually moved to New York already. So the extension to making Old New York seemed pretty clear. So I got in touch with Matt from the New York Library and talked with him about what we might be able to do together. And within a week or two, Matt sent me this, which if you're not a software developer, this might look like a mess. But if you are a software developer, this is a really beautiful thing. This is pure data. So Matt sent me a collection of some information about roughly 40,000 photos that were in this digital collection. So here it is in a spreadsheet, so it's a little bit clearer, hopefully. It has information about what the photo ID on the library's website is, what date the photo was taken, and crucially also what the cross streets of the photo are. So for all of these photos, it has cross streets. And so when I saw this, I thought, wow, I've already created Old SF. These photos all have cross streets. Old New York is going to be ready in like 2 weeks, right? So that was January of 2013, I believe. So I think that was a pretty epically incorrect estimate. So I'll talk a little bit about why the project wasn't quite so straightforward as I expected. So first of all, what did I do with that data? So I took those addresses and I geocoded them. So geocoding is taking some text, so for example, 102nd Street and Amsterdam Avenue, and converting it into a latitude and longitude, which is what you need to put points on a Google map. So to do that, I used the Google Maps API. So I took this collection of data that Matt gave me, and I ran all 40,000 of those descriptions through the Google Maps API and got latitudes and longitudes out. So that was how I was able to put them on the map. And this was the result. So you might have a little cognitive dissonance here. It says Old SF, but this is definitely New York. So this was the 2-week version of Old New York. So it works. You can browse photos. It even has a time slider, which works. That's a feature that didn't make it into the final version of Old New York, which is something the library has been bugging me about. I'd like to add it back. But the problem is that if you look at these images over here, you can't really see much of what's going on, right? Even when you click to expand them, the photo itself is quite small. The image is dominated by these brown backing cards. And so when I saw that, I realized that it wasn't going to be a straightforward copy and paste of the old San Francisco site, that actually there was going to be some real work to be done making Old New York a great site. So that was kind of a sinking moment when I realized that it wasn't going to be a 2-week project. But Also, I am a software developer, so I thought, finding where those pictures are in these cards, like that's a cool engineering problem. So that was what I worked on next. So these cards come in all shapes and sizes. So some of these have one small image just on a corner of the card. Others have a larger image. Sometimes they have 3, 4 images on them. So there's a variety of ways that this information is presented. So to talk about how I solved that problem, how I extracted the individual images from these photos, I'm going to use this picture as an example. So this is taken at Union Square in the 1930s, I believe. So the building on the right in all of these is the W Hotel now at Union Square, and the building to the left is the one I work in now. So this has a little bit of a connection for me. So this is what's known as a computer vision problem, and these are really interesting problems, but they're also really frustrating problems, because when you look at this image and I say, where are the photographs? It's just incredibly easy to answer that question, right? As a human, you can do it without thinking, in no time at all. But the frustrating thing is that if you try to break down how you did that into individual steps that you could tell a computer about, then suddenly you realize you don't actually know how you did that. So that's a little bit different than most software problems are. So it's both interesting and kind of frustrating. So the first step in how I did this was I converted the images to black and white. So I looked at what the average color of the image was and just looked for areas that were similar to that and different from that. So I was figuring out which areas are foreground, which areas are background. So you can see that maybe simplifies the problem a little bit. There seem to be these clear white rectangles with maybe some brown colored bits in them that might be background. There's also some text on the top of the images that's considered foreground as well. So the next step is to kind of blur it a little bit, erode the smaller features in the image to try to get rid of some of the noise. So that does a good job of removing the foreground areas from within the images, but the text is still there. Then the next step is to find the regions that don't contain very many pixels. So if you look at the components of the connected areas of this image, the connected white areas, there's these 3 huge rectangles and then some little smaller smudges on the top. So using that sort of size threshold, you get rid of the small things and keep the big things, which in this case works really well. And finally, you look for rectangles. So there it is. So in this case, that winds up working really well. So it took me a while to figure that out. It wasn't really an area that I was particularly strong in, but it was a fun challenge. I'd kind of assumed that all of these cards had just like 2 or 3 images on them, but I felt like my algorithm was working really well when I discovered this photo, and sure enough, it found 9 images in this, or this one, it found 7 images in this. So there really was quite a variety of configurations of the cards. So this is that same photo that we were looking at, and here's what it looks like in Old New York. So there's the first image, looks like it got it pretty well. Second image did pretty well. Third image did pretty well. So that was really one of the big technical hurdles that I needed to overcome to build Old New York. And that was one of the things that really made extracting these photos was really one of the things that made it a bit more complicated than Old SF. So if you're paying really close attention, you might have noticed that this photo, this first one, on this card, it's actually rotated. It's rotated 90 degrees. It's this top one. So how on earth did I rotate it correctly? And the short answer is that I didn't. There are a lot of images on Old New York that are rotated incorrectly. So if you've browsed the site at all, you've probably run into a few of these. Fortunately, there is a rotate tool on the site, so you can just rotate them and fix them. And I think the site would be a little bit maddening to use without this. Like, you might have to rotate your laptop or rotate your head. But what's really cool about this is every time a user clicks that rotate button, it gets logged, right? Like, there's a message that's sent back to Old New York where I record, okay, a user thought that this image was rotated. And if I see that more than one user rotates the same image in the same way, then I can be pretty sure that, in fact, that image is rotated. So when the site first launched, almost certainly this image was rotated 90 degrees. But now with all that user feedback, I was able to rotate it correctly. So that's, definitely go around and click those rotate arrows. It does help the site. So after the launch, maybe a week after the launch, I think I corrected the rotation on about 1,000 of the photos. So that's really started to become apparent. All right, so one of the other differences between Old SF and Old New York is that for each individual location on Old New York, there tended to be a lot more photos than there were on Old SF. Old SF would usually have 3 or 4 photos in each location, but Old New York, there can be 100 easily. So to find the interesting photos or to find the time period that you're interested in, it helps to be able to scan through all the photos quickly. Old SF had this little list view that you could scroll through, and then you had to look through each of the photos individually. But just playing around with Old New York, it didn't seem like that worked very well. And it took a while to think of a good UI analogy for it, like a good way to present all of that information. And suddenly, one day, I remember realizing that the right UI was something I used all the time. It was Google Image Search, right? So Google Image Search, you do a search, it presents you with a grid of images, and then you click one, and it expands. And then you can navigate through all of these, and you also get a description of the photo on the right. So with that in mind, the UI for Old New York seemed fairly clear, right? It's a grid of images. You click an image, you get a larger version, you get a description on the right, and you can navigate through them. So that was really a good breakthrough just in the way to present the information. So that was another difference between Old SF and Old New York. So something that I'd noticed pretty much the whole time I'd been working on Old New York was that all of the images had a back of the image as well. And oftentimes the back of the image had typewriter text on it. But the typewriter text had never been transcribed by anyone. The only bits that had been transcribed were on the front of the cards, which usually was things like the dates and the cross streets, which are really important to have, but not really like the full description of the image. And so I had some extra time this winter and thought that this might be a fun project to work on. So I learned about the process of using a computer to transcribe text, which is OCR, optical character recognition. So this is another one of these computer vision problems, right, where it's very easy to complete a task yourself, but then when you step back and try to think about how you did it, you have absolutely no idea. So the task here, one of the tasks here was, given this image, where is the text? Which is completely trivial for any of us to do, but when you try to get a computer to do it, it turns out to be quite hard. So I'm not going to get into too many of the details there. So then the next step was to, given a bit with a smaller image with just text, convert it to foreground and background, figure out where the individual lines are, and then recognize what the text is. So there's some cool computer vision stuff that goes into this. I guess I'm not going to get into too much detail. Just wanted to talk about this image, though. So the part that, this is kind of the core part of transcribing the text. You take an image that's just a single line of text, and you try to figure out what the letters are. So when I say you, I mean the computer here. So this is done using what's called a neural net. So what it does is it takes each individual column from the image, each column of pixels, and it scans across the image. And the neural net has been trained to activate particular outputs, one output for each letter of the alphabet, as it passes through that character. And so this image on the bottom is the activations for this particular image. So as you go across, you can see that there's this activation for capital A, then an activation for capital U, then G, then U. Then it gets this one wrong. It thinks that this is an A, which, I mean, it's clear from looking at the text that it's the word August, but that's not what the computer is doing. It's just looking at the pixels for the letter S there. So if you kind of like blur out the A, U, G, U, and the T, it is actually kind of ambiguous what that letter is. It's a little bit smudged. So you can see that A is the dominant output, but there is also this secondary output on the bottom for the letter S. And so as you train the network, it starts to get better at these sorts of tasks. You can see also it missed 5, and it thought it was an S, but there were a bunch of alternative interpretations. So I ran that process over all of the images in Old New York, and for the most part, I think it worked pretty well. So here's an example of one of the images that it scanned and the text that came out of it. So it's basically correct. There might be a typo here or there, but for the most part, it's quite readable. And I think having it there adds a lot of value to the photo. There are also some examples where it doesn't work as well. So here it's starting strong. It's looking pretty good. Chelsea College, 10th Avenue, great, very legible. And then you just kind of get into this line noise here. So the problem is it gets to this stamp that's on the image, and it thinks that that's text. And so if you feed in something that's not text to something that's trying to recognize text, you're going to get garbage. So that's kind of what happens here. So one of the things that I did right before launching Old New York was I added this correction tool. And I'm so glad that I did this in retrospect, because this was one of the areas where I was really surprised by the response. I think I got something like 10,000 typo corrections from users. I wasn't really sure what I was going to do with all that information. I thought I'd be able to look at each of them one by one. But 10,000, that's a lot. You can't really do that. So I looked through a few of them and convinced myself that there weren't really any problems with people trying to vandalize the site, and I just published all of them. So a lot of if you looked at the site the day it launched versus like 2 weeks after it launched, the quality of this text improved significantly. Not that you can't still find typos. So that's actually one of the other great things about this feature that I didn't think about at all when I launched the site, is that it meant that no one could complain about typos, right? If I had launched without this link, I think I would have gotten a lot of complaints that the site was filled with typos. But by putting that link there, suddenly it wasn't my problem, it was your problem. So
Chelsea College, what they call it, Chelsea College, it's 10th Avenue between, can you read that?
20th to 21st Streets.
That's not Chelsea College, that's the General Theological Seminary.
Well, you can go to that photo and leave a comment. Yeah, it's right here.
But
Yeah.
I'm technically tragic. Whatever I say, you want to use it, go right ahead.
So just to illustrate how this works, so I'll take that line noise and remove it and submit, and it says, "Hey, thanks for your contribution." So, and then the other thing I'm glad I did, it doesn't show you the same image; it shows you a new image, which might also have typos. So I saw people get really into this, like individuals, maybe some people in this audience, just going through hundreds of these photos, correcting typos. I think there's something like soothing about getting that like editing instinct out. Nice. Well, yeah. Thank you guys for your contributions. It definitely does make the site a lot better. Oops. I need to reload this. So, what does the future hold? What else is left to do? So, one thing that's a problem. I don't know if anyone here lives in Stuytown, but if you do, you might have been disappointed by the coverage of your neighborhood. So, the problem here is that that geocoding step that I talked about at the beginning, it's fundamentally a little bit of an anachronism, right? Like these cross streets were cross streets in 1920, 1930, but the geocoder that I'm using is Google Maps. It's in 2015. The street grid is not the same in 2015 as it was in 1920, And that's clear in places like Stuytown. So if you zoom in on the map, there's absolutely no cross streets in Stuytown because there used to be a different street grid here. So that's something that I'd really like to add these images to the site. They do exist in the collection. I think there's on the order of maybe like 3,000 images of Manhattan that aren't on the website yet. So I think it would improve the site a lot if I could get those up. So just thinking about this, like one way I could solve this problem is I have a geocode for Avenue A and 26th Street. I have a location for Avenue A and 14th Street. Maybe I can just interpolate what the location of all the other cross streets are. It seems like that should work pretty well.
How do you show an address that used to exist and where it is now?
Yeah, so it would look a little bit weird. It would be at a non-existent road on the map, but you would at least be able to see the images. And hopefully, if you live there, you would know how to interpret that. The site also does. I don't know if any of you guys have tried to load it on a mobile phone. This is maybe an odd choice in 2015 to launch a desktop-only site, but it doesn't work very well on phones. That just wasn't something that I put any effort into. So if any of you out there are mobile developers, either here in person or on the internet, the data is all available, and I think it would be really awesome if there were an old NYC mobile app. You could imagine using your location to find old photographs that are around you. I think that would be really cool. So if you're interested in doing that, please get in touch. So we went through that OCR correction process, and there's this within a few days. It says that within a few days, your correction will appear on the website. That's a little bit aspirational right now. So if you've been submitting corrections and not seeing them, I'm sorry about that. That's definitely something I'd like to tighten the loop on. There's also the possibility of putting other collections of photographs into the website. There aren't the collection that Matt introduced me to was particularly well suited to this because it already had cross streets. But there are many other large collections of New York photos. So these two images are from the New York City tax collection from the 1940s. One thing I love about these is that I guess back in the days of analog photographs, if you wanted to attach some metadata to a photograph, you just held up a stick with the metadata and got it to be part of the photo. Just like blunt, but incredibly effective, right? Because it would be very hard to separate that image from its metadata. So that's another direction that the site could go. I would love to incorporate other imagery into it, which kind of gets me to the final takeaway. So one of the great things about working with the NYPL was that they're big believers in open data and like being very liberal about what you let people do with your data. And I think it's kind of one of the ultimate takeaways from this whole project is for institutions that have photo collections is that if you're liberal with your data, then sometimes good things that you would never predict happen, like Old New York. So thank you all.